What actually happens to a continent in the 2 weeks after its worst heat wave in recorded history finally breaks? Most people assume the answer is simple. The heat leaves, the danger leaves, with it, everyone exhales. Researchers tracking Europe's June 2026 heat wave found something closer to the opposite. The heat was the warning. What came after was the event nobody had actually planned for. Start with the headline everyone already knows. World Weather Attribution confirmed this heat wave as the most severe ever recorded across the continent, with 45% of 854 cities in 30 countries breaking or nearing their all-time records for combined heat and humidity stress. That part of the story has been covered extensively. What hasn't been covered nearly as closely is what investigators found when they kept watching the data after the temperatures started dropping. That distinction between air temperature and combined heat stress is the detail investigators kept returning to. A thermometer reading alone doesn't capture how dangerous a heat wave actually is to the human body, because humidity determines how effectively sweat can still evaporate and cool someone down. That's why researchers use wet bulb globe temperature instead of a simple high temperature record when they want to measure real danger. And it's why some cities that didn't set a new all-time heat record still logged their single most dangerous heat event on file. The investigation into the aftermath started from that same instinct. Don't just look at the number everyone already reported. Look at what that number actually set in motion. The first thing they noticed was the drought. Not a new drought triggered by the heat, but an existing one that had been quietly worsening in France since the end of May, largely overshadowed by the heat headlines themselves. By the time the heat wave began to recede in mid-July, that drought hadn't eased. It had deepened day after day, even as thermometers finally started falling. Investigators tracking soil moisture found that the heat hadn't just failed to coincide with the drought. It had actively accelerated it, baking whatever moisture remained out of ground that was already critically dry. That finding led directly to the second discovery, and this is where the investigation starts revealing something the public hadn't been told to expect. Dry, heat-stressed vegetation doesn't just sit there waiting for the weather to improve. It becomes fuel. In Spain, firefighters backed by 30 aircraft spent days struggling to contain a wildfire that ultimately burned an area roughly the size of San Francisco, forcing more than 1,000 people to evacuate. In Germany, roughly 320 hectares burned in a single national park in one day, requiring militaries, helicopters to be brought in to fight it. In France alone, wildfires had already burned about 110 square kilometers by mid-July, nearly double the amount recorded by the same date the previous year. None of these fires started during the peak heat. They started in the days and weeks the heat left behind. Investigators also found that this wasn't confined to a handful of isolated regions. France placed 49 of its 96 mainland departments under its highest heat alert level during this stretch, meaning close to half the country was simultaneously managing fire risk, drought, and grid strain at once, not as three separate emergencies, but as one compounding event moving through the same territory in sequence. Public health systems absorbed a parallel wave of pressure, with hospitals reporting sustained increases in heat-related admissions, well past the point where the headline temperatures had already dropped, since the physical toll of extended heat exposure on already vulnerable patients doesn't reverse the moment a thermometer does. Investigators then turned to a completely different system, one most people wouldn't think to connect to a heat wave at all, the power grid. And this is where the pattern became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. France's nuclear plants, which supply the backbone of the country's electricity, rely on river water for cooling. As river temperatures climbed in the wake of the heat, French officials had to curtail nuclear output at multiple sites, including Blaye, Bougie, Golfec, and Saint-Alban, because water levels and temperatures no longer met the thresholds needed for safe, environmentally compliant cooling. At the Choose site, low water levels in the Meuse River forced a similar limitation. This wasn't a one-time event either. Investigators found this exact pattern had now occurred in 2003, 2019, 2022, 2023, and twice within the summer of 2026 alone. Now here's where the investigation reveals something genuinely uncomfortable, a structural detail that rarely gets discussed openly. The systems designed to keep the lights on during extreme heat are frequently the same systems that heat itself disables. Nuclear power is Europe's largest source of low-carbon electricity, and it is simultaneously one of the pieces of infrastructure most physically vulnerable to the exact conditions a warming climate keeps producing. The grid needed more power specifically because millions of people were running air conditioning to survive the heat at precisely the moment that heat was forcing some of the grid's largest generators offline. France's own economy ministry had to grant temporary exemptions allowing at least one plant to keep running past its normal environmental discharge limits, an acknowledgement, in writing, of the tension between protecting river ecosystems and keeping the country's electricity supply secure during exactly the days it was needed most. The knock-on effects reached beyond France as investigators widened the search. In the UK, grid operators issued balancing alerts and absorbed rising costs to keep supply matched to a demand spike driven almost entirely by cooling. In Germany, a major outage during the same window left thousands of households without power, layering an electricity failure directly on top of an already dangerous heat event. Regulators and grid operators across the continent are now openly discussing longer duration battery storage and faster approval processes for grid upgrades as a direct response, which tells you how seriously this particular finding is being taken behind the scenes. Germany's investigation into its own grid turned up a parallel problem playing out on the water instead of on land: shallow water. Levels on the Rhine River, a critical shipping corridor for goods across Central Europe, began hindering barge traffic, driving up transport costs during a period when the broader economy was already absorbing the costs of the heat wave itself. Only later, rainfall began bringing river levels back toward normal, offering a temporary reprieve, rather, than a resolution to a structural vulnerability that reappears nearly every summer now. Like and subscribe if you want investigations like this one, tracking what actually happens after the headlines move on, because that follow-through is where the real story almost always lives. Investigators then pulled the thread further into the storms that followed the heat and found a pattern consistent with something meteorologists have flagged before. As the extreme heat finally broke in several regions, it gave way not to calm weather, but to violent, fast-forming storms. In France and Germany, falling trees and lightning strikes tied to those post-heat storms killed at least 3 people within days of the heat receding. That detail matters because it confirms something investigators in other regions have documented too. The transition period immediately following a heat dome collapse is frequently more dangerous, storm for storm, than the steady heat that preceded it, precisely because people have already mentally filed the event as over. Zooming out from these individual findings, investigators started connecting them into a single pattern rather than a list of unrelated bad luck. Extreme heat dries the ground. Dry ground burns easily and fuels wildfires. Wildfires and drought stress water systems already strained by the heat itself. Strained water systems force cuts to the power infrastructure needed most urgently during and after extreme heat. And the boundary where that heat finally breaks produces its own separate wave of violent, unpredictable weather. None of these are 5 separate disasters. They are one interconnected chain, and the heat wave itself was only the first link. This is also where a financial thread enters the investigation, one that rarely gets attached to weather coverage at all. Insurers across several European markets have started repricing coverage in regions hit hardest by this cascading pattern, treating drought, wildfire, and grid instability as correlated risks rather than isolated ones. That shift matters beyond any individual policyholder's premium. When insurers begin pricing a region as structurally higher risk across multiple categories at once, it becomes a signal in its own right, one that property values, agricultural investment, and even local tourism industries start reacting to long before the next heat wave actually arrives. It's worth being precise here about what this investigation can and cannot claim. Will trigger this exact cascade in this exact order. Attribution scientists are careful to note that the specific combination of drought timing, grid vulnerability, and wildfire risk depends heavily on regional conditions that existed before the heat even arrived. What they can say with confidence is that as heat waves grow more frequent and more intense across Europe, the odds of this kind of cascading aftermath rise right alongside them because the underlying vulnerabilities, aging grids, heat-sensitive nuclear cooling, drought-prone, agricultural regions aren't going away between now and the next event. There's also a genuinely uncertain thread investigators are still pulling on, one worth labeling clearly as unresolved rather than confirmed. This wasn't Europe's only major heat event of the summer. It was the 3rd significant heat wave the continent had endured since May, following spells in spring and early summer that had already broken records of their own. Some researchers tracking this pattern have raised the question of whether back-to-back heat waves within a single season compound the underlying vulnerabilities faster than any single event on its own, since soil, rivers, and grids may not fully recover between one heat spell and the next before a new one arrives. This idea is still being actively studied and hasn't been confirmed the way the wildfire and grid findings have. It's included here because it's a genuine open question among the researchers tracking this data, not because it's already been proven. So what does an investigation like this actually mean for someone who doesn't live near a nuclear plant or a wildfire zone? The practical takeaway isn't about any single piece of infrastructure. It's about timing your own preparation to the full aftermath, not just the peak heat. If you live in a region that just came through a severe heat wave, check whether local water or power authorities have issued any advisories in the days following, since curtailments and outages frequently arrive after the headlines about the heat itself have already faded. If you're in or near an area with drought conditions, treat the week after a heat wave breaks as higher wildfire risk, not lower, and follow local fire authority guidance on outdoor burning or spark-producing equipment during that window. Specifically, and if severe storms follow a heat spell in your area, don't assume the danger passed when the temperature did. Falling trees and lightning during that transition period have proven just as capable of causing harm as the heat that came before them. It's also worth building a household plan that accounts for a short-term power interruption, specifically in the days following a heat event, not just during it, since that's precisely when grid curtailments and unrelated outages have repeatedly stacked on top of each other across this investigation. Keeping perishable medication, backup phone charging, and a few days of stored water on hand isn't over-preparing for a heat wave that has already ended. Based on what investigators found here, it's preparing for the part of the event that hadn't even started yet. Europe's worst heat wave on record was never really a single event with a clear beginning and end. It was the opening chapter of a much longer chain reaction, one that investigators are still tracing through drought maps, river temperature logs, and grid failure reports weeks after the thermometers came back down. The heat got the headlines. The aftermath is still writing the rest of the story, and I'll be tracking exactly where that chain leads next. That's ultimately the finding worth remembering longer than any single statistic from this investigation. The moment a heat wave ends is not the moment to stop paying attention. Based on everything investigators traced through France, Spain, and Germany this summer, it may be the exact moment the real risk begins.